Welcome back, everyone. So now we're going to move on to our third session on trade and environment. For this session, we have three presenters in the following order. Here we have Harry Lee from the University of Hong Kong, followed by Oscar Avila from Central Bank of Colombia, and Ziho Park from National Taiwan University. So there'll be 25 minutes for presentation for each paper, followed by 15 minutes of open discussion. And we request the first 5 minutes of the presentation to not be interrupted. But after that 5 minutes, you're encouraged to ask any question. YouTube participants can post their question online, and we will find the right time to pose this question. And with that, please welcome Harry.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. So this work is joined with Alan Feng from the IMF and also my student at University of Hong Kong, Yulin Wang. Okay, so since we have an IMF co-author, so I'd like to make the your disclaimer that the views in this paper are those of the authors and do not represent the views of the IMF. Okay, so we know that fighting climate change, we talk about climate change all the time. Fighting climate change requires international collaboration. Right, so from the point of view of emerging market economy, where we are right now, emerging market economy requires financing and good technologies from advanced economies to fight climate change, right? However, the consequences of climate change are unevenly distributed across countries. What I mean here is think about the cool and rich countries in the north, for example, Sweden. They're not really affected too much by global warming, right? But if you look at countries in the south, I mean, they're warm, they're hot, they're poor, and they're particularly vulnerable to climate change. Okay, so in this paper, we asked the following questions: why should countries with low climate risk at home care about climate change? So we propose a new mechanism by which climate change affects countries' macro and financial performance, which is a cross-border propagation of climate risk through international trade. Okay. So to fix idea, and for those of you who are not really like working on this kind of questions, here's a simple example for the global value chain, right? So if you look at the country in the middle, we call it the midstream country. For example, in China, tire is produced, and to produce tires, Chinese companies source input, which is rubber from Thailand, right? And Thailand can be considered the upstream country. And if you look at downstream country, Japan produces cars. Okay, so what we do in this paper is to study the impact of climate disaster here. Let's say a disaster, unfortunately, is China. How that affect macroeconomic performances and financial market in Thailand and in Japan, in upstream and downstream countries. Okay, so what we do here is we construct data sets on global macroeconomy, trade, stock market indices, climate disasters, transport infrastructures, and climate risk for the past half a century. Okay, and we link each climate disaster to the country that is directly affected by the climate disaster and the main upstream and downstream trade partners. Okay, the countries that trade most intensively with the countries that is hit by the climate disaster, and we determine whether the disaster hits transport infrastructure. Since we want to document that international trade is playing such an important role in propagating climate disasters to other countries. Okay, so we want to study the heterogeneity, across the disasters that hit transport infrastructures versus those that do not hit infrastructure. Okay, and we want to investigate the impact of climate disasters on the real economy, and to do that, we use a matching and stacking a difference in differences strategy. Okay, and we study the impact of climate disasters on financial market, stock returns in main trade partners, and we take a standard financial market event study method. This method is commonly used in the finance or accounting literature. Okay, and in the last part of the paper, we study the relationship between stock market valuation measured with PE ratios and exposures to foreign long-term climate change risks. So with that, we can discuss how should climate change risk, this long-term risk affect stock valuations in individual countries through the trade channel. Okay, so here are these the results I would like to report to you today. So what we find is first, climate disasters that affect ports, those that hit ports, significantly reduce the affected countries' imports, exports, output, and they also undermine GDP in the main international trade partners. Okay. On the other hand, the climate disasters that did not hit ports, or those that hit, the infrastructure that are less important for international trade, do not have these, negative effects on trade or on the main trade partners. Okay. And we find, climate disasters restructure supply chains. So why we call this a supply chain restructuring? We find that climate disasters disrupt trade in the downstream. So basically, if a climate disaster breaks out, the country that is affected by the disaster has a smaller export share. They have less to sell to downstream countries, right? So trade is disrupted in the downstream. But on the other hand, we also find trade is strengthened in the upstream. The countries that are hit by climate disasters increase their import shares from upstream countries. So basically, they have to rely more on inputs from upstream countries to consume or to rebuild. Okay, and we quantify the impact of trade disruptions or supply chain organization on upstream and downstream GDP using a new decomposition formula. If we have time, we can talk more about it. Okay, and we find that climate disasters have negative impact on a main international trade partner stock returns for aggregate market and tradable sectors. A stock market data is helpful in the sense that they have detailed information on the sector level. So we know the heterogeneous returns across sectors in the main trade partners. We find for most tradable sectors, their stock prices are adversely affected by foreign climate disasters in the main trade partners. But if you look at non-tradables like telecommunication, their stock returns are not affected by foreign climate disasters. Okay. And in the last part of the paper, we study, how exposures to foreign long-term climate change risk affect, asset valuations measured with PE ratio for the aggregate market and tradable sectors in the home country. So basically, similar to what we had, for the event study, right? We find exposures to these foreign climate risks reduce the stock market valuation in a home country, and in particular for the tradable sectors. Okay. So we look at the real economy. We take this event study approach. So the events we consider are 430 non-overlapping climate disasters. So for a climate event or sort of a something that is related to climate to be qualified as a disaster, they have to satisfy the following standards defined by the IMF. They have to affect more than 0.5% of the country's population, or they cause a damage of greater than 0.05% of GDP. And we also keep the disasters whose event windows do not overlap. So to make sure that we have a clean pre-trend, right? And event window in this case is from 4 months before the disaster's start date to 4 months after the disaster start date. So let's say a disaster happens at time t, the event window is t minus 4 to t plus 4, right? So we keep the disasters whose windows do not overlap, okay? And we work hard to find a clean control group. So for each climate disaster D that is hitting country ID, we find a clean control country I prime as the control group, and we require that controls are not hit by any climate disaster within the event window. And also, they should be, according to propensity score matching, they should be most similar to the treatment country in terms of GDP and population. Okay. Here, right here. Okay, they have to affect more than 0.5% of population, 0.05% of GDP, and they have to be no, it's not climate related. The data source is emergency event database, MDAT. So in a sample, climate disasters include storms, hurricanes, heat waves, and drought. So these are 4 major kinds of climate disasters. I mean, we can talk about predictability later. I mean, we did a bunch of tests for that. Okay. So here is the event study figures that show how climate disasters affect the home macroeconomy. Okay, so I have other results, but here we focus on trade. So on the left figure, I show how climate disasters affect exports, and on the right, we show how they affect imports. Okay, and the black line shows the impact of climate disasters, the heat ports. Okay, so what we did was we get the area that is affected by climate disaster on the map. Okay, and we project the locations of infrastructure on the map, and we determine if these disasters heat ports. Okay, so what you can see from the figure on the left is disasters that heat ports significantly reduced the country's exports to other countries. Whereas if you look at the disasters that did not heat ports, due to a large confidence interval, we can now conclude with confidence that they significantly reduce imports. Okay, and what is interesting from the right is the two kinds of disasters have different or the opposite effects on imports. The disasters that heat ports significantly reduce the country's imports, but those that didn't heat ports increase the country's imports. So this is related to that countries have incentive to smooth consumption, right? So production is disrupted in this country, and they want to consume, so they have to rely on foreign consumption goods or intermediate inputs. And if transport infrastructure is disrupted, I mean, they want to import more, but they could not, right? That's why we see a decrease in here. But we see that the disasters that didn't hit ports raise the country's imports from other countries. Okay, and with that, we due to such supply and demand shocks, we naturally would like to investigate how climate disasters affect other countries, in particular the main trade partners. Okay, so we first define the two sets of market shares that are important for this analysis. So the first is the share of output, defined as the ratio of country I's trade flow to country K divided by country I's output. So we both fix these numbers to time t. Okay, so we have an output share that is time varying, depends on a month of study. Okay, and the main downstream country K is the country to which the midstream country I sells the largest share of output. Okay, and in the upstream we have the expenditure, which is the share of midstream countries' expenditure that is sourced from upstream countries. So again, I denotes the midstream, country J is the upstream. Okay, and the expenditure equals the trade flow from I to J divided by country I's total expenditure. Okay, and with the expenditure, we define the main upstream country. Okay, and to study how disasters affect macroeconomy in other countries, again we use the event study approach. So on the right-hand side, we interact this time dummy with the exposure measure to downstream countries. So here we consider the downstream, and we can do upstream in a similar way. So how should we think about downstream countries' exposure to the midstream disaster? So let's say a disaster causes damage ID in the midstream country due to climate disaster D. Okay, and if you think about production loss, and such production loss is split across all downstream countries, the loss in supplies from midstream country I to downstream country K will be equal to the midstream's damage multiplied by the output share. Okay, and we then divide this with the downstream countries' GDP. So that's the downstream's exposure measure. It's a supply shock relative to downstream countries' GDP. Okay, and we follow the literature to control for fixed effects and standard clustering method. Okay, so in terms of control group, the control group for the downstream country is the country that is not affected by any climate disaster during the event window. They are not midstream or main downstream, and they are the main downstream of the midstream control group. Okay, so what this means is we have a midstream country that is hit by climate disaster, and it has a control group, and we find the main downstream of the country in a control group, and we exclude the countries that are directly affected by these disasters.
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, please.
It seems that you divide the countries ex ante in midstream, upstream, and downstream.
Yeah,
Do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, for each disaster, we define the upstream, midstream, and downstream. Yes.
Okay.
Say that again. So I think 40%. So 430 multiplied by 40% is about 160. So so this is the figure for, I mean, upstream and downstream GDP. I think this is a pretty cool figure. So if you look at the disasters at heat ports, they significantly reduce the GDP in downstream country and in upstream country. Okay. And on the other hand, if you look at the disasters that did not hit ports, they did not significantly affect GDP in downstream and upstream countries. And we get these magnitudes by multiplying the coefficients that we identify here with the summary statistic or the mean of the downstream's exposure matter and the upstream's exposure matter. We get these magnitudes. So on average, climate disaster reduces main downstream country GDP by 0.5% and reduces main upstream countries' GDP by 0.36% in the first month if the disaster hits ports. Okay?
Can you give a sense of could these be driven by different types of disasters hitting ports and non-ports, or these differences? Could it be driven by the types of disaster rather than the target of disaster?
So here I'm focusing on this port trade mechanism, and what you are suggesting is.
No, I'm asking. It would be nice to see maybe get some sense of whether there's similar types of disaster hitting ports, and there's others. What I'm saying is if there's selection on the shock here.
I see. So I think it would be helpful to control for the disaster type fixed effect, right? So we got a fixed effect for a hurricane and then a fixed effect for thunderstorm. Yes, we can do that. We haven't tried that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So now we move on to discuss the impact on trade disruptions. Okay, and as I suggested before, trade is disrupted in downstream. If you look at the figure on the left, the disaster affected countries are having a small export share to downstream countries, and in particular, so for the sample of disasters that hit ports. Okay, and if you look at the figure on the right, so what we see here is the climate disasters increase. Actually, they increase the share of imports from upstream countries. So what this means is, disasters make countries rely more on foreign imports. Okay. So with this, we can do a decomposition that helps us understand the contributions of supply shock versus supply and demand shocks versus trade disruptions on GDP in downstream. Because we see an increase in the share of imports. I mean, if they rely more on domestically produced products, we will see a decrease in the. And we also see an increase in import share from main upstream countries, right? The main trade partners that we focus on, right? So this is evidence you're requesting, right? So they. Yes. I think you can put it this way. So for the disasters that hit ports, they reduce the country's imports, but to a less extent than the reduction in the country's consumption or GDP. Right. So I mean, countries are definitely doing badly with climate disasters, but their supply chain is strengthened in the upstream. They rely more on upstream imports from upstream. So that's the takeaway. Okay. And with these two facts, we can do a decomposition. We decomposed the impact of disasters on downstream and upstream GDP into this supply and demand shock and trade disruption. So let's use the downstream specification as an example. So what is a supply shock? The supply shock is measuring how disasters propagate to downstream countries according to a fixed share of output. Okay, so let's say trade is not disrupted at all. So the midstream's climate disaster is split among all downstream countries according to a fixed trade share. Okay, and we divide it with GDP. And trade openness or trade disruption measures, how the change in export share or output share affects GDP in downstream countries. And due to this literature on gains from trade, we know that if trade is disrupted in downstream, I mean, they may contribute negatively to downstream GDP or consumption. Okay, and we have a similar specification for upstream. Right, supply and demand shocks mean that the impact shocks if we hold fixed the trade shares, and trade disruption term measures the impact of changes in trade shares on downstream and upstream countries. Okay, so here is a summary of the results. We find trade is indeed disrupted in downstream, but they contribute very little to the output loss in downstream countries. So supply shock contributed 98% to the GDP loss in downstream countries, and trade openness contributes about 2%. Okay, and since supply chain is strengthened in the upstream, the demand shock contributes more than 100% to the loss in upstream GDP, whereas this strengthening in trade linkages with upstream countries reduces the negative impact on upstream GDP by about 1/3. Okay, so that's the decomposition. We can talk more about the specification later. Okay, so moving on, we look at the financial market. We use a pretty standard financial market event study approach. And again, we have the same event window as before. So the estimation window where we estimate the CAPM model runs from 12 months before the disaster started to 1 month before the disaster started. And with that, we fit this model, and that model will give us the normal return or the return on the stock market if there were no climate disasters. Okay, and we take the difference between the actual return and the normal return, and with that we get an abnormal return. That can be considered as the impact of climate disasters. I mean, do this accumulation that will give you the cumulative abnormal return or the total loss from climate disasters. Okay, and during the event window, which runs from 20 days from before the climate disaster started to 80 days after it, right? We get this cumulative sum. Okay, and we compute the mean and confidence interval, and that will give us the event study figures. So we see very large impact, possibly due to demand shock in upstream stock market loss. So basically, an average climate disaster reduced main upstream stock market return by 1.5%, and the impact on downstream is smaller, about 1%. But we both get significance in 4 months. Okay, and we look at cross-sector heterogeneity. We see a significant decrease in the stock returns in the tradable sectors, for example, chemical and automobile sectors, due to foreign climate disasters. But we don't see any effect in these service sectors like telecommunication, finance. I mean, they don't show anything, as a response to foreign climate disasters. Okay, and in the next step, we do a cross-disaster, analysis. We regress the cumulative abnormal return or the total loss from foreign climate disasters on the upstream and downstream exposure measures that we constructed before. Okay, and what we show in this table is that exposure to foreign climate disasters indeed reduce stock market valuations or stock market returns in the home country, and this result is robust to different clustering of standard errors and fixed effect controls. Okay, and we interact exposure measure with sector tradability, and we consider a pool regression of all sectors. And once we introduce this interaction term, the level effect becomes insignificant. What this means is, the negative impact is concentrated in the tradable sector. So we consider two alternative definitions for sector tradability. So one is a dummy that equals 1 if a sector is tradable sector, and the other is the sector tradability measure defined in the previous slide, which equals the sector's total trade divided by the sector's world GDP. Okay, so we get once we introduce the interaction term, the level effect becomes insignificant, right? So that's takeaway number one, and takeaway number two is we look at the two samples, heat import and those that did not heat ports. Okay, we see very large impacts for the sample that of disasters that heat ports on the tradable sectors, where we don't see anything on this sample. Okay, and in the end, we investigate the associations between exposures to foreign long-term climate change risk and domestic stock markets asset valuation, a measure with P/E ratio. Okay, and we construct upstream and downstream exposure measures like before, and we run correlations. Okay, so we see exposure to foreign climate risk is negatively associated with stock market valuations in the home country. And again, if we introduce this interaction term, level effect becomes insignificant. Okay, and we did a bunch of placebo tests. We show it is not driven by openness to trade, trading with large countries or countries that have faster economic growth. Okay, so with that we conclude. So what we find is in this paper is climate shocks that happen to any country in the global supply chain can significantly affect macro financial performances in other countries. That's why we are all in the same boat. Countries work together to build climate resilience in other countries. Okay, thank you very much.
So I think Shafat already asked this question on the climate disaster. So if you say climate disaster, is it kind of all disasters related to the climate or a specific one?
So I responded to this question. So we consider 4 types of climate disasters. There are hurricanes, floods, storms, and heat waves, or maybe more. So basically, they first need to be a climate event, something related to climate. So earthquake is not climate event, right? And then they have to be big, like they have to satisfy specific standards, defined by the IMF.
But did you have a criteria for choosing the kind of climate, the disasters that you chose? Did you come up with a criteria?
I mean, it is in a paper. I think I made the point clear, right? First, it has to be a climate-related event, and second, it has to be big, right? For the specific definition, I mean, it's in the we don't have.
What kind of data did you use for the climate disaster?
So it's called EMDAT, Emergency Events Database.
Hi, Lawrence. I'll refrain from using the climate and disaster in the same sentence and next to each other. Maybe you can use the term climate-related disaster. I'm disaster risk reduction specialist, actually.
Oh.
And can use climate-induced disasters, but still you cannot, it's impossible technically in any way to connect climate change with any single disaster. So it's good for you can use the term hydrometeorological disaster or something, or in case context of Asia or Southeast Asia, you can use because here I think floods is number 1 and tropical cyclone. So better term. I don't think MDAT has any data, any climate disaster term. Sure, it's the Belgian database, right? That we are using. The Belgian based, yeah. I don't use the term climate. Yeah. But you are refraining also from the events that can have, because climate disaster, climate-related disaster or climate-induced can be a drought. Or there are other events which are slow onset disasters. And for those, no damage or loss is assessed because it's not an emergency. So maybe you are referring to those disasters that have a quick onset. They can cause sudden disruption of. In case of Asia, you're not limiting yourself. It's okay because floods and the tropical cyclones, but in other countries can be like I don't know, Japan. It was tsunami plus earthquake or tsunami. So typically they have also cascading events. So you cannot just take one single event.
Yeah, I mean, so we did the following robustness test, if that helps. So we consider a detrending and seasonalizing or whatever it is called. So we take out the regular components in the disaster damages of the disasters that we consider. So in a way that we filter out the regular part of these climate events. effects. And I mean, that's one of the robustness tests that we did. And on top of that, we also consider, I mean, different kinds of robustness tests. For example, detrending the outcome variable, detrending the GDP. Right? Is this something you are looking for, or I mean, you're speaking from the back. I can't really get your point. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that also the database, they do not connect events. They are only the last 30 years, and they take only those events which have a big impact. So they take either in number of deaths or that are damage and loss assessments, which is a common methodology World Bank and UN uses for assessing events. So maybe you are limiting yourself, and if you focus only on those climate events, it's general terms, maybe the robustness of all your findings is not so.
I mean, we use that to help identification, right? So you can always, expand the sample, but I mean, I don't know. I think, what we identify here is robust. Okay. Yes.
It's like after 4 months, it's still elevated,
Yeah.
right? So you have a potential confound. You may need to scrub it a bit.
Yeah. Right. That's a good point. Yeah, we only focus on the 4 month.
Yeah, but then in your event studies, it shows that after 4 months, they're still elevated toward.
Yeah, we can try revise this test.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you. And so I was screwing my mind on this. So you find that stock market, both upstream and downstream go down, right?
Yeah.
GDP, both upstream and downstream go down. But then on the trade results, you have the thing that, upstream countries are stronger, right?
Mm.
So the logic of what might be driving this both decline in GDP and the stock market on the upstream country is still to be explored, right? From what you're saying. The mechanism.
Yeah, that's a good one. So, I mean, my response would be this is a decomposition, right? So what these tables show you is this reorganization of supply chain reduces the effect on upstream countries. It is really not telling you like what the benchmark be. Maybe the demand effect is just stronger than the supply effect. Yeah, I don't know. I think I should explore that.
And the other question, more general, was it seems that you have very detailed data to say whether one port is affected or not. But if you think about the U.S. now, so there's a disaster hitting Louisiana or Texas, right?
Uh-huh.
And then because it's a port, you say that it affects. And then if it's in Miami, there is not a port, and so it doesn't affect. That's how you do it. It's a question of clarification. Because if you think about these big countries, like U.S., India, China, maybe even a sub-regional dimension would be more appropriate if you want to.
Yeah. So what we did was, we have a world map. We match climate disasters to the area that they affect. You can see they are denoted with these red circles. They're not really like, if US is heat, we highlight the whole US as red. So we match the emergency events database with a recent database from Columbia University. So they have very detailed information about the geographical scope of these disasters, and we match those with.
And for each disaster, then you go upstream and downstream. That's what you're doing. So midstream is what you define to be the center of the disaster, and then you go upstream and downstream from there.
Exactly.
Okay, now I understand.
Sorry. Yeah.
Also,
I've got a couple of questions. One of them is I'm wondering if the climate events we have here are satisfying strict or some kind of weak exogenality. One thing that we know that happens during these kind of events is the government consumption goes up. The government steps in and the government spending is going to go up. Whether that's going to be completely correlated with these climate things and whether that introduces any bias in those estimates in terms of their causal effects. That might be even more important given that one of the selection criteria for the climate event was if the effect on GDP was of some magnitude, right? So if the government really steps in and doesn't allow the GDP to go down as much, no matter how big the event is or how big the effects are on other sectors, the overall GDP might not have gone down as much. The final thing about the anticipation effect, especially in those financial markets event studies, the financial markets are much faster incorporating those anticipation effects.
Exactly. I mean, these are fascinating questions. So, we identified the total effects of climate disasters. So that includes everything, including responses in the private sector as well as the public sector. And presumably, public sector will have offsetting effects on the on disasters, right? But we still identify an overall negative effect. So if you take out the government, if the government didn't do anything, presumably the impact would be even larger, right? And I also include these the analysis on other macroeconomic variables. This is consumption, right? Private consumption also decreases in downstream and upstream. Sorry, there's a typo. This should be midstream and downstream and upstream. So this is a better measure for the private sector. Okay, and regarding the anticipation effect, I mean that's exactly why we want to fix the starting point of the event window to 1 month before the climate disaster, because there are like better forecast kind of stuff, right? So we want to use that to sort of control for the anticipation effect. Also, we did pre-trend analysis. Most of the figures do not have a pre-trend. I mean, some little bit of that, but if you look at this upstream figure, I mean, there's no significant pre-trend, right? And similar for the figures for the real economy, right? So I think we can do more robustness tests to improve on. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. Yes. Yeah, we didn't do it in this paper, but we are actually thinking about how we should incorporate these empirical findings into a model, a framework that can better understand the questions that you suggested. Of course, we can do some accounting exercise, but yeah, this is a good point. Yes. I mean, in the end, I hope we can put this the findings here into policy. So.
Yeah, just a quick one. So for small countries, okay, so does your findings imply that for small countries, is it more imperative to have the adaptation measures like upgrading infrastructure like ports, roads, and so on, rather than with the limited resources, rather than involve themselves in reducing carbon emission initiatives, because a small countries doesn't, even if it eliminates carbon, it doesn't, make a dent in the emission anyway.
I mean, so, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the story we are trying to push. So for emerging market countries, small island economies, it might be more helpful, if you think about their roles in the global value chain for other countries to help them build adaptation. So I think this table sort of speaks to your question. I'm sorry, this is a very small letters here. So what we find here in column 2 and column 4 is that emerging market economies are more vulnerable to foreign climate disasters. So we interact the exposure matter with whether the upstream and downstream country is an emerging market economy. We do get a significant sign here. So what this seems to suggest is emerging countries are less able to adapt to foreign climate disasters, probably because they have bad infrastructure. They cannot easily switch suppliers and customers, right? But if you look at if the midstream country, the country affected by climate disaster, is an emerging market, we don't see any difference here. So probably emerging market economies are indeed more vulnerable, but as a trade partner, I think we can do more analysis related to small economies.
Thank you. So yeah, we'll move on to, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank
We'll
you.
now move on to the next presenter.
Okay, thanks everyone for having me here. It's actually a pleasure to be in the other side of the world. I'm from Colombia, so it was a long trip to be here. The usual disclaimer, I'm from the central bank, so these are my views and the views of my author, not necessarily the views of the Central Bank of Colombia. So what I'm going to do in these next couple of minutes is to talk about how foreign climate policy from the rest of the world affects a small open economy like Colombia, and if there is a space for Colombia to do something to avoid basically the negative effects of the policy in the rest of the world. As they were saying over there, back there, what we do in terms of climate change is, as a small open economy, is not going to have a huge impact on climate change. However, the policies of the rest of the world, they are going to have impacts on the small open economy, especially in an economy like Colombia, that we export basically commodities and carbon intensive goods. So the motivation from here is that basically what we know in terms of climate policy is that most of the climate policy that is going to be taken over the next couple of years is going to be most likely to be unilateral trade policy unilateral policy. It's really difficult to get a lot of cooperation in terms of the countries. So what we are going to keep seeing is that countries unilateral, they are going just to be taking policies on their own. Usually what we have seen is that there are a couple of options for climate policy. One is to keep raising taxes on carbon goods, on the production of carbon intensive goods. But if countries keep doing this, they are going to basically face a lot of, oh God, I was getting used to this. They are going to get a lot of challenges in terms of the domestic industry. So if they keep raising domestic taxes or domestic taxes, they are going just to keep losing competitiveness in some domestic industries, and they can generate a lot of carbon leakage. So basically, production can go somewhere else, and this is something that they really don't want. So there is a lot of attention on what is called now the border carbon adjustment, or BCAs, which is a complement to pricing on domestic production. The way this basically works is kind of an import tariff. So we are going just to increase the tariff to the goods that they use a lot of carbon in a sense. This is actually better for the domestic industry, because it's going just to basically level the playing field of domestic industry that are already paying taxes with imports that they don't pay those taxes. So of course there are going just to be some considerations in the implementing economy. So if we think an economy that is put in a VC, that is going just to have some basically some results or some effects on domestic industry. But right now this is not our concern. Basically what we want to understand is what is going to happen in the other economies where I put the tariff. And especially what we want to see is what is going to happen in an economy like Colombia, which we cannot do much in that sense. So what we want to do is two things. So first, to understand what is going to be the effect of this increasing tariff on the domestic industry. And the second one, if there is a policy response that we can do basically just to try to reduce the negative effects of this foreign policy. So what we're going to do is we're going to adopt the perspective of a small open economy like Colombia that is facing some increases in BCAs by the foreign partners. What we are going to analyze in these papers is basically we're going to focus on the effects on this domestic economy, and basically we are not going to take any considerations of climate change. So we want just to see what is the effect of the policy, and we are going to see what the policy generates. And what we are going to use, the tool that we are going to use is a model with trade adjustment dynamics. We are going just to have a model with full dynamics. So we are not only compared within steady states, but we want to see also the transitional effects of the policy since the announcement. So the idea here is that today we know that in the future, maybe in 5 or 10 years from now, things are going to be more difficult. So we want to know if it makes sense to start doing something today, or we just wait until the policy is implemented. And then we can see what are going to affect right now, the transition, and in the steady state. And this is going to be really important for the long run and short run response. So this is related with a bunch of literature. I just want to say mostly of the literature for these policies is for big economies, for developed economies. And they usually what they do is just to compare between the steady states. So there are two contributions from this paper. One is that we are going to focus on the perspective of a small open economy like Colombia. And the second one is that we are going to use all of the analysis for the transition dynamic. So the setup here, we said a lot that is a small open economy, but it's not a small open economy model. It's actually a multi-country model. But we are going to take this perspective of a small unit in that economy. We are going to model three economies. Two of them are going to be big. We're going to have two rest of the world. One is going to be a climate conscious coalition. You can think about Europe. It's a climate conscious coalition. And we are going to have the small open economy that is going to be Colombia. And then we are going to have another rest of the world, which is going to be the one that is not going to implement any climate policy. We're going to have 4 layers of production. So on the top layer, we are going to produce final goods that basically are going just to use for consumption and investment. And to produce these final goods, we are going to use basically intermediate inputs from two sectors here. One is going to be a clean sector, and the other is going to be a dirty sector that basically uses energy intensively. To produce goods in each sector, we are going just to use basically a combination of sector-specific inputs. So basically to produce the goods for the clean sector, I'm going to use domestic clean goods and imported clean goods that they come from the rest of the world 1 and from the rest of the world 2, and the same for the dirty goods. The difference between these two is that basically to produce dirty goods or from the dirty sector, we are going to use more energy than to produce for the clean good. And to produce each of the inputs, we are going to use a quite standard production function with labor, materials, sector-specific capital, and fossil energy. We are going just to have some endowment for commodities, and we are also going to produce energy with
clean energy.
What was that?
You don't have clean energy, green energy.
No, we do have just changes in the intensity in which we use each of those. But yeah, we can adapt. Yeah. Because the one that is going to use the difference between clean and dirty is how intensively they use the fossil fuel. Yeah, that's basically. I think with this is going to be a little bit more clear the structure of the economy. So this is kind of the picture for a particular country. So what we are going to have is some households. These households, they are going to have, the country is going to have an endowment. Basically, we can say this is oil or raw materials. And they are going to have an endowment of labor. This endowment of labor and the endowment of the raw material is going to help me to track the size or the relative size of the countries. This is going to be kind of a target in the calibration. Then we're going to produce fossil energy. To produce fossil energy, we're going to use all of the endowment of the commodity. We are going to use some labor and some specific capital for this sector. These sector-specific capitals are going to be quite important for the transition, because once you have a shock in one sector, then you cannot move immediately capital to another sector. So you are going to have some adjustment in there. Then what we are going to do is we are going to have two big sectors in this economy. One sector which is going to be basically kind of the clean sector, and the other sector is going to be the dirty sector. The difference is, again, how intensively they use these fossil fuels. So this sector is going to be the one that uses those fossil fuels more intensively. And well, the production structure is going to be, we're going to have a set of heterogeneous firms that they are going to produce domestic inputs that they are going to be used for production of intermediate goods that are going to be sector specific, and those sector specific intermediate goods, then we are going just to combine to produce investment and consumption. And these heterogeneous firms, they can not only produce for the domestic market, but they can also produce for the foreign market. And here is where we are going just to have basically the BCA acting as a way of a tariff. So basically a shock is going to come through here. That is kind of the basic structure of the model. I'm going just to show you a couple of equations because I think these are kind of the important equations of the model, and I'm going just to give you a glimpse of where the dynamics is coming from. But the way we produce in each sector, clean and dirty, what we are going to do is to aggregate the domestic production of intermediate goods. We are going to have a set of heterogeneous firms that they differ on productivity and on the exporting status. So basically here we're going to have a firm can have basically three states. They are not exporters, they can be a new exporter, or they can be an old exporter. The idea of this difference is just to capture a little bit of the slow adjustment into exporting market. And we are going just to have that to produce the basically the clean or the dirty input. We're going to combine domestic, yeah.
So your tax on the carbon content of your exports, right?
Yes.
And that also depends on your own fossil fuels, but also on fossil fuel embedded in imported use inputs.
Yes.
Will we see any reallocation to cleaner exports?
Yes, that's basically you're going to see the results. What happens once you put the policy, you're going to see a lot of reallocation in the economy. Yeah. And here is where the tax is going to come from. Basically, it's just in the imported of clean or dirty input. Okay. So where is the dynamics of the model coming from? It's actually coming from many sides. One is from the presence of capital. So we have capital accumulation, so that is going just to have us a little bit of dynamics in the model. But the other there is that we have a lot of firm decisions into this model. So the first one is that these firms are going to pay different fixed costs. The first cost that they are going to pay is an entry cost. So the only way they are going to pay it is if the expected value of entry is positive. Once they pay that fixed cost, they are going to have a productivity draw that comes from a Pareto distribution. That's the one that we have in the morning. And once they observe the productivity, they decide if they produce or not. So given the demand, they pay a fixed production cost, they maximize profits, and then at the end of the period, we have an exogenous exit in the model. If the firm survives, they play this game again in the next period. And this is regarding basically the production for the domestic market. All of these firms, they act in monopolistic competition. That's the only sense we can have all of this, and they are heterogeneous. Basically, they are producing a specific good. For the export decision, we are going to have a couple of costs here. So we are going to have a fixed exporting cost, which is going to be different for new exporters and for all exporters. So the idea here is that basically new exporters are smaller. That comes from the data. And all exporters, well, they are bigger. They have a higher exporter premium. They face some fixed costs, some iceberg costs to sell abroad, and they also have to pay some tariffs. And basically, given this cost and the foreign demand, they decide if they pay the cost or not. So, and we also assume that a new firm that enters the market, they cannot export in the first period. So the only way if they export is that if they at least survive one period. And that's basically the whole dynamics. In terms of the production of each particular sector, what we have is, so to produce a unit of one particular good, we're going to have an individual productivity. And we are going here just to have a combination of a Cobb-Douglas production function that uses capital, labor, and materials. These materials are going to be sector specific. So for the clean sector, we combine clean and dirty, and the same for the dirty sector. And we are going just to combine this Cobb-Douglas factor with energy that comes from DC. And to produce DC, we use basically a production function like this. And that's basically the important parts of the model. I don't want just to get you bored with that. What we are going to do is to calibrate this model and analyze the effects of what if the rest of the world imposes a BCA to all of its trading partners. So basically, the rest of the world, Europe, is imposing a BCA not only to Colombia, because actually that's ridiculous, but to Colombia and the rest of the world too. Okay, and we are going to analyze those effects. And we are going to do two policy exercises. So the first is just to analyze what happens with the BCA by itself. The second is like, okay, what if Colombia starts doing something? What if Colombia starts putting some domestic policy? to try to reduce the production in the dirty sector. And we are going to use two exercises. What if Colombia does by itself, unconditional of what the rest of the world does? And the second one is that, okay, what if the rest of the world compensates me for doing that policy? And we want to see what happens in the two cases. So this is how we are going to calibrate the model. So we are going to use a Colombian data, which we have really nice data for the manufacturing census. We are going to, the first thing is that we are going to reclassify the sectors into the dirty and clean. This is according to the high-risk carbon leakage from the European Union. The main data sources are going to be the manufacturing census for 2019, the input-output metrics for 2010. We are going just to calibrate for each sector some sector-specific moments that are going just to talk about the iceberg cost and the fixed cost in the model. So we can identify each these 5 parameters with 5 specific sectors. We are going just to basically target trade openness, the fraction of new and all exporters, the sales premium, and the share of exports of the new exporters. And we are going to assume Cobb-Douglas production functions in other parts of the model so that we can use basically the input-output matrix exactly. And this is basically the policies that we are going just to implement here. So the first one is that the Climate Conscious Coalition is going to announce a tariff increase of 50% on the dairy sector in 10 years. So it's telling today that in 10 years, we are going to increase the tariff. And we want to see the response of that. And then we are going to compare this with the policy response of the small open economy. What if the small open economy, what does is to increase the tariffs on the usage of oil, of energy. And we are going to see what happens in two cases when we have unconditional or conditional policy. So this is what happens in the small open economy after. So here is the announcement. This is period 0. The line is just the initial steady state. And this is going to be implemented basically in kind of around year 10. Yes, go on.
Yeah, I lost the size of the shock is
50%. So
of the baseline. So
on the baseline.
If 1%, if it's 2%, it's 1%.
Well, yes, but so the baseline here is kind of, if I am not wrong, we are moving this from 10% to 20% or something like that.
To 15. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So if taxes are 10% in the baseline scenario, they jump up to 20%. Okay. Yeah.
But these are on the carbon content, right?
Yeah.
So it's endogenous.
For the shock we are doing here, we are assuming exactly the size of the shock. We are trying to do some other exercises in which basically what we do is that the rest of the world one, they already have some carbon taxes initially. But Colombia, let's say they have 0 carbon taxes. So the initial shock somehow we are also trying to calibrate so that the cost of using energy in the two kind of levels up. But that is not exactly this exercise. So for this one, we are assuming we are increasing tariffs from 10% to 20%. And this is basically a shock. Yes.
So quick question. So I thought the results would depend on the relative size of the green conscious and the non-green conscious. And
yes.
So, for example, you can get an equilibrium where the green conscious withdraws, but there's complete switching to the non-green conscious world. So you can conceive of a model where you have no effect at all. How come you get unambiguous results?
So what is happening here is that basically the rest of the world one is increasing tariffs for everyone, not only for the small open economy, but also for the rest of the world too. So in that
open
case,
economy can export to the rest of the world.
Yes, but given that the rest of the world too is also paying more taxes to export to the rest of the world one, there is a demand shock. So actually, if we decompose this, I don't have it here, but if we decompose these shocks into what is just the effect of increasing tariffs to a small open economy, and anyone else, the effects are actually really small, because in that case, the small open economy just exports everything to the rest of the world too. But given that the rest of the world too is also affected by the tariff, in that case, there is not that much reallocation. So most of the effect actually here is coming just from the drop in the demand, in the global demand due to the policy. Yeah. So we have here, so actually the effects here is kind of, I'm going just to show you some numbers in a bit, but we have a drop in consumption that actually the drop is bigger in the short run, kind of in the transition, than in the new steady state. And we have a lot of adjustment here. We see a drop in gross output, a huge drop in exports. We are increasing here a 50% kind of the distortion in the sector that we export the most, the commodity sector. But what is interesting is that we see a lot of reallocation in the sectors. So this is the sector, the blue one is basically a clean sector, the red is the dirty sector. So we have a lot of reallocation in the economy. It takes some time to reallocate resources between one sector and the other. But actually this reallocation basically generates that the drop in consumption in welfare is not that big in a sense. These are the results. What if if Colombia, on top of the BCA, it does domestic policy that punishes the usage of dirty energy? Well, this is basically adding up the distortions in the economy. So if Colombia puts this policy and is not compensated for doing this, we are actually worse off in every sense, which makes sense. But what if we are a little bit compensated by the policy? So what if this is kind of a 50% compensation? So Colombia increases the taxes for using fossil fuels, and then now the rest of the world doesn't increase to 50, but increase just 20%. So in that case, a compensation policy actually makes things better in terms of welfare. We have fewer reallocation of resources in the economy, which kind of makes sense because the shock is a little bit smaller. In terms of numbers, this is kind of the welfare calculation with respect to the initial steady state. And here it is interesting just to see what are the dynamic versus the static effects. So the initial policy, which is the BCA, we see kind of we compare between two steady states. The drop in welfare is around 1.6%. In the dynamic case is 1.48. This is because the first period's consumption is not falling that much, and they matter a little bit more for welfare. And we have more welfare losses when we have the unconditional policy, and fewer welfare losses when we don't have the unconditional policy. Here we just combine it, like what if we have different unconditional or conditional policies.
So just one quick question.
Yes.
So you can, I'm interested in the scenario where you can suffer the border cost adjustment versus situation where you go clean yourself.
Yeah.
And then you avert the border cost
Yes.
tax at destination market. What is the answer there? Is it welfare? Is it better to go green on your own economy wide, or to suffer the consequences of a border cost adjustment?
So if you are compensated for that,
no, forget about compensation. The two choices: either you are forced, or you do it yourself to avoid. So between a domestic carbon price versus a border tax,
is going to depend a lot on how avoiding that is going to be. So basically, if I just do the policy by myself.
So what are you assuming about the conditional? How clean do you have to be to avoid the border tax? Let's say you make some assumption about
Yes.
that. Is that you're saying that relationship?
Yes.
But supposing you have the EU threshold for cleanliness,
yeah.
which would avert the border tax completely.
Yes, in that case, we have, it's going to depend a lot on what is the comparison, in how much they are going to increase the tax versus how much that costs me. So depending on how we define that, it could be a scenario in which it's much better to clean yourself to avoid the tax. But it's going to depend a lot on how they are designing the policy. So, and we are working a lot on that, just to try to use really well the data. Just for instance, to say how much should be the increase in taxes from the rest of the world or on the BCA to get this. But yeah, we are working on that, and we have some scenarios in which that can happen exactly. That it's better to clean yourself, but it depends a lot on the design. Yeah. Yes. Yes, and I think that's why, yeah, that's why kind of in the production function, we are for the part that we use the energy, we are trying to not to use a Cobb-Douglas production function, that we can basically use all of these substitution effects when you try to move away from the dirty technology. So in that case, it's going to depend a lot on the parameters. Right now in the model, it's going to depend a lot on the parameters that we're using. I think this is all. So we are already kind of in the discussion. So, yeah. Yes. 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 From the census data, we can do that. Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yes. Yes. And actually, that's kind of what happens in the model. We see a lot of reallocation to those firms that they don't use this intensively. Yes. Yeah, in the data, we can actually have way more. Right now in the model, we just have for convenience 2 sectors, but we can go at least once we have some nice results, we can even go a little bit more dispersed in that. And actually in another project with George Alessandra, we have more split sectors into that. Yes, yes, it's only, yes, yes. So here the BCA is just to all of the sectors that somehow they use in energy more intensive. We are not basically using the dispersion of that. That can be also nice because, yeah. Right now, yes. Right now, yes. We are working in something in which also the BCA adjusted endogenously in how much we are using the fossil energy. So we are trying to do that calculation. That is even better. It's like when we endogenize really and make the increase in the BCA depending on how much we are using energy, that give us some really nice results. But we are kind of working on that.
Okay, so we'll open up the floor. I mean, it's already open. To questions. Well, let me use the time I have to just ask my question. So two questions actually. First is about what happens to the usage of fossil fuels in these different scenarios that you did. Are you equating that by, so how are you looking at the scenario? So compensation versus no compensation, domestic versus foreign, carbon adjustment penalties or carbon penalties. Are you equating the fossil fuel reduction?
We are not grading that, but of course, like in all of the scenarios, we see a drop in the usage of fossil fuel.
But that could be another metric to look at how
Yes,
achieve
yes,
bigger.
that for the policy design,
Yeah.
we are kind of trying to do what is the best. What is the best? If we make the policy basically response to how much we are using the fossil fuels or not, but yeah.
And secondly, how again your point about relevance or dynamics? Could you just explain the transition? How that, I know that gives us a bigger sense of the transition, but in terms of results, welfare results, how will it change?
So basically, well, one, we just compare the two steady states. We are not seeing all of this drop or anticipation before the actual policy. So this gives us a sense of if it is important to do something today or not, and also to play around with the timing on when to do the policy. So here, what we are doing is that the BCA is announced to be in 10 years, but if the economy does something, it starts doing it right now. And in that case, it gave us like some nice results in which doing something today is much better than just to wait 10 years, because all of this takes time, like in terms of investment, in terms of the access for the export market. So that's what all of the trade dynamics give us in this case, is that it matters to start doing something today. If we just wait 10 years, it's worse, actually. We haven't played with the when. Right now, we just have the start now or start in 10 years. But we can also, we have play around also, what if the European Union announces to do this in 10 years, but it suddenly does it in 5 years instead of, what if they just move the calendar? We have seen things like that.
They never do it.
That is also yeah, that's another thing that we are trying to do, is just playing around with the uncertainty.
But just one quick thing, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, the when one depends on fixed costs, how quickly things depreciate, whether you're, risk of stranded assets or not. Another is Daria's question of how quickly you expect cheaper technologies to emerge. And
Yes,
the third twist is, and this is the argument people make, that that there's scope for learning by doing in green technologies, that there are nice papers which show the cost curves. So you can't look at the cost curves as a static comparison. If you switch to green today, your costs are likely to be lower tomorrow if you work with it. So I think it's a very nice question you're asking, but I think this question of sunk costs or the pace of depreciation, the emergence of new technologies, and the cost reduction by using technologies might be things that you at least want to think about.
Yeah, in that case, I think we need to change a little bit the setup to basically have some trends into the model in terms of like growth in the productivity of the clean sector. We haven't considered that. I think that is an interesting thing to do, is to have some trends into these models.
Sorry, I'm pretty sure it's just my own problem. So what is the conditional tariff adjustment? Can you?
The conditional tariff adjustment. So we have the first is that we just have the BCA. The other is the conditional policy. So if Colombia does some domestic policy, what if it does it regardless what the rest of the world does? That is the unconditional one. So basically, we are adding just two frictions into the economy: the BCA plus the domestic policy. And the conditional one is that if I do the domestic policy, they reduce a little bit the BCA. That's
specific.
Yeah. Yeah, in that case, we are kind of playing around a lot with the design of the.
One question here.
Yep.
This is Fabian Vera. Very nice presentation. When you mention the relevance of the dynamics, you are also trying to see the responses and the graduality in the responses. Have you tried using the derivative?
What was that?
Have you tried using the derivative?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. And yeah, of course, the speed kind of the adjustment is the closer you get to the date of the actual implementation, the stronger the response of the economy. So like in the first years, the economy responds, but not too strongly. It responds mostly on investment and on the export market, not that much in consumption.
Yeah, the background of the question is because in engineering, when you do pressure transient testing, you use the first derivative or the second derivative to find how the responses are in log times or semi-log times.
Yeah, no, that would be an interesting metric
Absolutely.
to introduce. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thanks.
We'll move on to our next presenter.
Okay. Thank you for having me today. Today I will present trade policy uncertainty, offshoring, and the environment. So this is joint work with Karim, University of Hawaii, Jay at HEC Montreal, and Guyon at UC Santa Cruz, and me, National Taiwan University. So the pattern that has been documented pretty much, well-known pattern is that there is a global divergence in pollution emissions between high-income countries and low-income countries. It appears that high-income countries tend to produce less pollutants, and developing economies tend to produce more pollutants. And this is cross-sectional. However, if we look at the trend, this pattern is even more stark. So in the late 20th century and in the 21st century, developing economies like China and India, their emission has been growing pretty fast. Whereas, to the contrary, the emissions from developed economies has been going down. So this has been documented, but There are many theories why this is the case. And then concurrently, while this is happening, what is also happening concurrently in this world economy is, of course, global integration. Now it's easier to access imported intermediate goods, and then we now have better offshoring opportunities. And also, China has expanded to the international market. So on the one side, there is this global divergence in emission patterns between developed economy and then developing economies. And on the other hand, there is this global integration and expansion of offshoring. So we start to wonder, is there any connection between these two? Our argument is that there is. And the hypothesis that explains both of these patterns is pollution offshoring hypothesis. And then what it says is that progress toward trade liberalization leads to relocation of high polluting activities from developed to developing countries with laxer environmental regulations. And there is ample discussion in policy circle and media, but in the literature, economics literature, there's limited causal evidence. And also, in this literature, which tries to test pollution offshoring hypothesis, an important aspect that is missing in our opinion is that offshoring is an investment decision. Of course it is. And then it involves a lot of upfront cost. And then also we know from the literature on trade policy uncertainty that trade volume responds very sensitively to trade uncertainty. So we believe that it's useful to use some shocks to trade policy uncertainty to test pollution offshoring hypothesis. And that's what we do. In this paper, we study long-run environmental consequences of trade liberalization, which reduce trade policy uncertainty in the US, and then its impact on US manufacturing, and explore mechanisms through which firms adjust in environmental margins. And a priori, the direction of change is ambiguous, right? When an import competition is more intense, it might be the case that the US firms now they need to compete with Chinese companies which are located in a laxer environmental regulation, so they might have to even emit more pollution. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, as is well documented, US manufacturing employment goes down, the share of manufacturing employment goes down because of import competition from China, and therefore emission probably goes down. And another possibility is that, and perhaps because of offshoring, the emission also goes down. So there are possibilities that go to the opposite direction. So it's not quite clear which direction will dominate. So what we do is, using changes in US trade policy with China, which granted permanent normal trade relations in 2001, as a shock, we find that there has been a significant and persistent within establishment declines in pollution emissions. We emphasize within establishment. So you might think that it is pretty obvious that emission would have been going down because of import competition, because US manufacturing has been going down. But that is not what we find. It is not because the US emission goes down, not because manufacturing size goes down in the US. Also, it's not because of exit of establishments. It's primarily because continuing establishments now emit less pollutions than before. And also we show that this impact is more pronounced for establishments that face tougher environmental regulations. So therefore, it's additional evidence in support for pollution offshoring hypothesis. And then also this impact is stronger for establishments that operate in upstream industries. And then also those which have within firm global sourcing networks. So all of these patterns are inconsistent with the pollution offshoring hypothesis. And further support for pollution offshoring hypothesis is that it appears that there is a tendency of those U.S. firms which produce dirty products to relocate their subsidiaries to China. And also at the product level regression, we find that the share of imports from China grows even more in dirty products. So all of this is inconsistent with the pollution offshore. Yes. Hoarding products constant. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a likely plausible explanation, we'd say. So we do not have data on what products are being produced in Chinese subsidiaries. We don't have that data. But however, the channel that you just described is a plausible explanation. Yeah, so our work is related to the cleanup of the U.S. manufacturing literature. So it has been well documented that U.S. manufacturing has been becoming cleaner, and there are many studies about that. And we are pointing out that international trade, especially import competition from China, appears to be largely responsible for that. And then there's also literature on trade and environment, and also literature on pollution offshoring hypothesis. But to the best of our knowledge, this literature has not paid too much attention to the trade policy uncertainty aspect of pollution offshoring hypothesis. And also we can contribute to the this China Shock literature. Oh. So the data we use is toxic release inventory data, which provides U.S. facility level data, and it has information about for each chemical, the pollutant chemical. This data report the amount of emission from each U.S. facility that has more than 10 employees. And then also it provides pollution prevention efforts that each facility invested in. And then they also provide breakdown of the total pollution waste. So release, this is the primary focus in our paper. But this data also has information about waste management. So the amount of recycling, the amount of treatment, the amount of energy recovery. So this provides these rich set of information about what each facility can need when it comes to production waste. And then, but however, one problem is that in this data, the reporting threshold for each chemical has been changing over time for many chemicals, and the list of the chemicals that it requires to report also has been changing. So we focus on those chemicals that are constant in this respect. And also we primarily focus on the chemicals that are mapped into particular matters. The other data that we use is National Establishment Time Series data, which covers a near universe of U.S. establishments from 1990 to 2020. And good thing is that both NETS data and TRI data have the same establishment identifier, DUNS number. So it is a merge. And this data has establishment characteristics, like employment, sales, and industrial location, trade status for each year for each establishment. And so we use this matched data. We focus on 1997 to 2017 because this is the year that provides the constant group of chemicals. And then also the other data that we use is WRDS. This will be studied. This will be used when we study the mechanism. So this data contains subsidiary information of U.S. public firms, and using this data, we show that there was a tendency of U.S. firms building subsidiary in China, especially among those U.S. firms which produce trade products. And then we also use international trade data at HES 10-digit level. We show that later. Dirty products seem to have experienced a bigger increase in the share of imports from China. So let me first show you some stylized facts. First, using the method from Belitz and Plonick, we'll decompose the total emission decrease. So here in fact 2, number 4, the lowest one, the number 4 line, the lowest line, is the total impact, the total emission decrease in the US. So it has been decreasing. But however, if we isolate the impact from the scale effect, which is a declining manufacturing size, that doesn't really explain the declining emission. Also, even if we also add upon composition effect, that also doesn't explain that much. It explains very little. But what explains this pattern primarily is from surviving establishments. Those surviving establishments from 1997 to 2017. Also, entry and exit margin does not explain that much. It explains very little. So that what that means is that US manufacturing establishments shutting down does not really explain that much fraction of the declining emissions in the US. And also, what's surprising here is that this decrease.
Actually, can I ask? I don't know. Maybe everybody else understood. I didn't understand the last chart. So, the previous chart. Sorry. So, what is the punchline here? That the big deductions driven by.
The punchline here is that the gap between number 2 and number 3 is the biggest. That is the main point.
And that
is the surviving establishments.
So, I'm just thinking of the surviving establishments.
Surviving establishments mean those establishments which have existed from this year to this year. Those who exist throughout.
And we don't observe the ones that exited.
Yeah, so exiters will be included in number 4.
But exit doesn't explain much by itself.
Yes, number 3 and number 4 does not have much big difference, which means that entry and exit does not explain that much of its emission declines. Right. That's so the gap between number 2 and 3, that is the punchline.
So what is the scale effect in like surviving firms, surviving establishments can change in scale, right? So how would you decompose? Yeah, I mean, how would you decompose scale? You know, and surviving.
The total is number 4, not number 1.
I mean, what is the scale effect here?
So the size of the manufacturing sector itself declined.
Sorry, on this one, the drop is immediate for 1997 to 2002.
Drop where?
So the drop of, so you look at the long run, 1997 to 2017, but if you look at this line, right, it goes down in 2002, it's already down where it's at 2017.
Yeah.
So that calls, at least for some explanation, happening before 2001, which is the drop.
Yeah, sure. So here that's the case. Propose. So right now I don't have any good answer why before 2001 that has. But a story that is consistent with our finding will be that the import competition from China has been already been growing very fast ever since I mean 1980s, and especially in 1990s. Even before China entered the WTO in 2000, the imports from China has been growing fast already. It has become even faster after China entered the WTO, but the growth was already faster, already. So that is one possible explanation. Uh, yeah, but later I will show you that the pre-trend before 2001, there is no pre-trend between high NTR and low NTR groups of industries. So later you will see. So here now the fact 3 is that so this decrease in emission is more pronounced among import-intensive industries. So some industries import more, some industries export more. And then those, so x-axis here is the average import intensity of each industry, and then y-axis is a change in average log emissions in this period. And then here in this graph, the x-axis is average export intensity rather than import. So there's this contrast. For importing, there is this negative relationship, but for exporting, there is no such relationship. And this is a pattern that's kind of indicative already to a pattern that is consistent and is consistent with pollution offshoring hypothesis. Of course, that's not a definitive evidence, but at least it's indicative. So the empirical strategy we employ is that let's talk about institutional background. So in 1979 already, Deng Xiaoping visited the US and Deng Xiaoping met Jimmy Carter, and then they agreed that China will be subject to no more trade relationship tariff rates. And then so that has significantly lowered the import tariff that the US applies to China. But although the tariff rate has been already low, it has been already NTR tariff rate, but the problem was that there was uncertainty. US Congress had to approve the low NTR tariff rate for China every single year. And then especially that there was a lot of uncertainty, especially after Tiananmen Square massacre. And after that happened, US Congress House of Representatives actually passed to revoke the NTR status for China. That did not pass at the Senate, did not pass at the US Senate, but however, it passed. Oh. There was a great degree of trade policy uncertainty. And then, to measure the magnitude of the shock, we used the NTR gap constructed by Pearson and Shaw 2016 AR paper. This is defined as the difference between non-NTR rate and NTR rate. Non-NTR rate is the potential non-NTR rate in each industry that would have been applied if this NTR tariff rate was revoked by US Congress. And NTR, so therefore, NTR gap measures the degree of uncertainty, the degree of trade uncertainty. So let's see. So this using that, we use difference in differences approach. The first difference is the difference between high NTR gap and low NTR gap industries. And second difference is years before and after 2001. And then this is our empirical specification. So left-hand side is log of emissions from establishment P in each industry I in year T. And then right-hand side, our focus is that the interaction between an NTR gap and then the indicator for post-PNTR, which is basically after 2001. And then we have industry level controls, either time varying or time invariant. And then we include especially establishment fixed effects and county by year fixed effects. And then this is important because there are environmental regulations that affect each county differently, and that will obviously affect the left-hand side. And then by including county by year fixed effects, we are capturing that. So this is our integral specification, and our
the slide before, the 2 slides before this, why are you
This
using
one?
not this, the other one,
this
where you have the MFN tariff? Like I was wondering why MFN tariff and not applied effective or any other kind of tariff. Like why are you using the MFN tariff?
using why so your question is
yeah.
why we are constructing
Exactly.
why you are constructing NTR this way?
Exactly.
So this captures the degree of uncertainty, that this industry faces because of the uncertainty that the U.S. Congress might actually revoke the NTR status, NTR tariff rate for China.
So we have the apply effective tariff, we have the MFN tariff from the WTO. So I'm just wondering why you are using the MFN tariff in this case and not any other type of tariff.
So that is actually the NTR rate that is being applied because U.S. Congress actually never, U.S. House actually passed the revoking, but U.S. Senate never did it. So China was subject to NTR tariff rate, actually the NTR tariff rate from 98 to up to now, and then up to even before it entered the WTO.
So meaning China was independent, it doesn't have any relation with them. That's why you are using the MFN.
Yeah, the NTR tariff rate was actually being applied to China even before China entered the WTO.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is this shock is not coming from changes in actual tariff rate, but it's coming from the removal of trade uncertainty.
Okay.
Yeah. What changed after 2001 is uncertainty. What changed is not actual tariff rate. Where was it? Here. So this is our main result. So what it says is that granting PNTR to China caused a within establishment decrease in pollution emissions. And then we'll also conducted to show you dynamic treatment effects. So now the PNTR dummy is now replaced with each year dummy one by one, right? And then we show that there's no evidence of pre-existing trends here. And precisely after 2001, it appears that there has been a persistent and then negative effect, which accumulates over time. There are a bunch of robustness checks, like control for NAFTA tariff, and then different subperiods, exclude outliers, and excluding dominant industries which emit the most pollutants, and then various other weighting schemes, and etc.
So Joseph Shapiro has a paper that finds environmental regulations contributed more to the decline in U.S. emission than trade.
Yeah, that paper.
How would you reconcile these two findings?
Yeah, I know that paper. And that paper uses a model that has only exporting part, doesn't have importing part. That paper, and as I showed you, even in the stylized effect part, or I will also show you later in the mechanism part that it's not the export-intensive industries, or it's import-intensive industries that are responsible for this pattern. So. And then, so we also show that this decrease in emission is is not because of the extensive margin. That is, it's not because manufacturing establishments are shutting down. Even if we narrow down our sample to continuing establishments, we still find actually even stronger effect. And then, and this in our sample, the PNTR did not contribute to more exits of U.S. manufacturing establishments. And then also, we show that this is not because the size of the industry measured by sales is declining. We show that emission intensity, which is defined as the emission divided by sales, also declines. So emission intensity, so even if the dependent variable is emission intensity instead of emission, we still find negative impact. So let's now, I will show you patterns that are consistent with pollution offshoring hypothesis. So now it's true for differences, true for different diff. So the negative impact is stronger for firms that are import intensive, this one, firms that are more import intensive, and then contrast this with this. There's no significant impact for those firms that are export intensive. But for those firms that are import intensive, there is a significant impact. So this contrast is important. So this contrast is reminiscent, again, of the stylized effect that I already showed you. And also, this here non-attainment means those counties which are subject to stricter environmental regulations. And in those counties which are subject to stricter environmental regulations on pollution emissions, the negative impact is stronger. So this is, again, consistent with the idea of pollution offshoring hypothesis, which says that when trade liberalization happens, the companies in developed economies tend to move their operations to developing economies with laxer environmental regulations. And also this negative impact is stronger for upstream industries. And then we see that oftentimes upstream industries are the industries that offshore their production rather than final goods, because it's the U.S. consumers are the consumers of final goods products. And then also we find that for those firms which have more number of sectors within the firm, among those firms, the negative impact is stronger. So we argue that all of these are consistent with the idea that support the pollution offshoring hypothesis. By the way, we also have, for the sake of space, we didn't include in this slide, but there is also a difference for firm size. So firm size has been already taken into account.
So quick question, sorry, can you observe output or product level composition at the establishment level in the United States?
So there's the sales information.
So you can see the sales associated by, say, HS products for each establishment.
Yeah, it's sales information each establishment.
And is there a way of identifying within industries the products which are more polluting and less polluting?
Which are...
So when you see an establishment continuing, when you first showed the chart on composition, which I was confused by, that change in composition is not an establishment attribute in that first chart. So can you show us the change in composition of output? I think that's a question that Rajesh was also asking at the level of the establishment. And can you show that that change of composition involves dropping products, which on the basis of some other information we can see as more polluting, and so that the surviving establishments are specializing in cleaner products? Is that possible to show?
When it comes to product level, that's basically our, we have one product, and it's one product level analysis, and that is analysis where we show that for those dirty products, the share of imports from China increases even more because of PNTR. That is one thing. That is one analysis at the product level that we conducted. Other than that, yeah. So yeah, these are the we believe these are patterns that are consistent with pollution offshoring hypothesis, and we'll now try to provide even more direct support for pollution offshoring hypothesis. And then to do so, let's move on. Now, this is our first attempt to do so. We show that PNTR caused the within establishment increase in import activities. And that's not our contribution. This has been already known. PNTR causes an increase in import, of course. But what is new in this paper is that this impact is larger for establishments that initially faced tougher environmental regulations, and also those establishments that engaged in dirty production, which have a high emission intensity. And then also, we show that the PNTR caused an increase in the number of subsidiaries in China, even more so for establishments that initially faced tougher environmental regulations and those who engaged in dirty production. Again, for environmental regulation, we use the non-attainment county level measure. And our third attempt at doing so is the product level analysis that I just mentioned. This is a product HS 10-digit level analysis. And then we measure the share of imports from China, share of US imports from China. So share of imports from China divided by the total imports. And then that share from China increases generically, it increases generically, but it increases even more in industries that are dirtier, in dirtier products. So all of these patterns that I showed you so far, we argue, are consistent with the pollution offshoring hypothesis. Lastly, we investigated one another potential mechanism, which is a clean technology adoption. Well, we did not find support for this mechanism. So we really push for a pollution offshoring hypothesis. Oh. So we conclude, so we studied the long-run environmental consequences of trade shock in US manufacturing, and we showed that granting PNTR to China had a significant and persistent within establishment declines in pollution emissions. And then we find a strong evidence in support for pollution offshoring hypothesis. Yeah, thank you.
In terms of trying to kind of quantify your size or magnitude of the estimates, if you kind of look at the total, say, PM 2.5 reductions that happen across the US, can you like kind of come up with a back of the envelope calculations as to how much the policy you're looking at makes
if
change?
I can't quantify the number, I remember is I think it was 34%. So if we compare the if we move industry from bottom percentile of the PNTR to the top percentile of PNTR, then the 34% decline in emission.
No, I meant in terms of there's overall, for a variety of reasons, reductions are happening in the United States, right? One of them is the pollution haven hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
And there are but several other initiatives, like you were saying, you're looking at this. Maybe there are several other initiatives which we haven't thought of. I'm saying if you could make a decomposition analysis, let's say this is the total reduction that we observe in the United States between 97 to 2020, how much can your estimates account for the total reduction in some sense, right? That would be an interesting number to know.
Yeah, I agree.
The question is the trade war going to make pollution worse in the United States?
So it's unclear, right? First, it's unclear whether because so we approach this problem through the lens of trade policy uncertainty and as an investment problem. And then when it's an investment problem, what happens is there is a large upfront sunk cost. And then upfront sunk cost has been already paid. The US firms already built subsidiaries in China and already invested in China. It's unclear that whether, so even if there's a trade war going on, I'd say it's quite unclear, but that's also an interesting research agenda as well.
I think it would be interesting to see whether in your county time fixed effect, right, the dynamics over time, you could look at those fixed effects from your estimation. You could try to see whether these are related to the environmental regulations that you mentioned in the US. You have to see whether actually, those also played a role. And going back to the question of how you would quantify the different sources.
Yeah, the regulation played a role, and then regulation played the extent to which regulation played a role depends on the level of PNTR. That's basically what we just showed. So when there is this interaction, it's hard to just say that when there is interaction between A and B, it's hard to say that this percentage is just A, this percentage is just B. It's hard to say that, but where's the
Yeah, so my question is around the classification of like, have you considered the small and medium businesses? The businesses sort of were probably not like as not under scrutiny as much as large businesses. So in that differentiation, I mean, you spoke briefly about firm size, right? In one of the slides you mentioned because of lack of space, you are not putting that number up there. So I want to understand what's the differentiation between, say, a big business which is under more regulation, more scrutiny compared to someone who's like with pretty small, but on aggregate level, small and medium businesses may also be sort of polluting the environment, right?
Yeah, so we do not find any evidence that large firms respond more sensitively. We do not find any differential. For firm size. But when it comes to diversification, as I showed you, when for firms that have more number of SIC 4-digit industries, yeah, the negative impact is stronger for those firms.
I noticed that your study focuses on the environmental aspect of ESG, but your implication of work mentioned ESG policies as a whole. New wave of MFN implementing ESG policies. Does your study capture any data related to?
So we don't have ESG data in this paper, but in conclusion, we are just talking about what potential implication our work might have. So it's not what we actually need.